Hey, thanks for joining me today. I've had a couple people now reach out to me regarding an article in the New York Times. Thank you to Dr. Ted Trost and John. Um, happiness, and I give some information on this in the link and everything, but happiness won't save you. That's the title. Philip Brickman was an expert in the psychology of happiness, but he couldn't make his own pain go away. It's by Jennifer Senior. That's an op-ed in the New York Times, like I said, and it's really interesting, right? And very tragic, of course, but very interesting. Well, for kind of our discussion of happiness, and I have a couple points that I'll talk with you guys through about it. Number one has kind of made me reflect a little bit on my own course as well, but as well we'll get into kind of this GI Joe fallacy that psychologist Laurie Santos talks about, which is bridging the gap between knowing something intellectually and actually putting it into practice. We'll also talk a little bit about our relationship with pain, because this was, of course, a very uh, significant part of Brickman's story. So just for some background, I would recommend reading the article. There's links to it before we jump into this video. But if you've read it, Brickman's story, right? So he was basically an incredibly gifted, very successful psychologist who studied a lot of these questions around happiness and life. And again, very tragically, he ended up taking his own life, and he really struggled with happiness. So the first thing that this prompted me to do is really understand or not understand, even just acknowledge the complexity of happiness study. Um, it's it's a really incredibly difficult subject, and even my reminder to me that I'm really a student of happiness, right? It'd be crazy for me to try to diagnose Brickman's story and say, well, here's what he went wrong. Here's exactly. No, I'm a student of happiness, and sometimes I try to think, oh, I'm a happiness expert. I don't think any of us, including the happiness experts, are happiness experts. We're all, at our best, really students of life and students of happiness. So I was really humbled by this article and Brickman's story, and really, reminding me that, again, like I just said, all of us are ultimately students of happiness as well. So, next thing I get into, as I mentioned, is positive psychologist Laurie Santos. She has that incredible Coursera course on the science of happiness. And one of the first things she talks about is something she calls the GI Joe fallacy. And basically that comes from this idea that, you see here, knowing is half the battle. It's actually not even close to that, right? There's a huge chasm between kind of, theory and practice, right? Knowing something intellectually and actually doing it. And, again, this is just talking about this. I'm not going to try to diagnose Brickman's story, but I think that in this case, is a really powerful example of that phenomenon, right? That it's really just knowing something is not enough. It's extremely challenging to actually do and to implement, as the individual, but also if we think about, if we're a psychologist, a therapist, a coach, whatever, actually helping people to implement some of these things. So, when I think about Brickman, I'd be curious to know, well, what were his habits exactly? Was he practicing meditation? Was he doing gratitude journaling? Was he exercising? What was his diet, right? Because all these things sound like some self-help shit or whatever, but the truth is they're all shown, clinically, research, whatever, to have, to cause marked increases in measures associated with happiness and well-being, right? So whether it be actual neurological changes in the brain, right, with areas of the brain being activated and experienced meditators, whether it's like I said, exercise that regulates sort of your physiological hormones, diet, same thing. Was he practicing these positive interventions, or did he just know them? And again, they talk about that a little in the article, but I would wager that perhaps, again, and we all do this, we have to practice what we preach. Another thing that stands out related to that in the article is Brickman's belief that there maybe is no way off the hedonic treadmill. And the hedonic treadmill is essentially the idea that we're just, on a treadmill kind of chasing the carrot, right? That, any positive emotion we get is fleeting, right? Then we just, we crave more of it and we can never really get enough, right? Kind of process of addiction almost. And I would say that's, largely true, but I would also challenge it a little. And I do think, again, that practice is the vehicle that we can use to get off, or at least take a couple steps off this hedonic treadmill, right? Because it's been shown that meditation, for instance, can change the structure of the brain, that other positive interventions, which all that means is specific exercises designed to improve well-being, they can lead to sustainable changes. And even exercise, hell, that's been shown to be as effective as an antidepressant in some cases, right? And so, again, the big thing here, I think, that Brickman's story really highlights and can inform our discussion of happiness is, how do we cross that chasm, right? The G.I. Joe fallacy from knowing to really doing and practicing. So the last thing I want to talk about a little bit as well is the relationship with pain. Again, I don't want to pretend to be something I'm not. I'm very fortunate. I've, not had really any tremendous trauma or incredibly tragic experiences happen to me, and I'm thankful for that. But I still think that this is something worth considering, and there's two kind of things I look at with this. Number one is, we can kind of apply a war on two fronts idea to dealing with pain, in my opinion. And that's the kind of existential, reflective, big question pain. But there's also just, zoom into the ground level pain of moment to moment kind of physiological mental condition, right? Because, it could be just, I love my life and stuff, but I have some sort of physical ailment. It could be I feel like I have a good life, but, neurologically or, neurochemical wise, I'm just, depressed. But it could be, more the day-to-day is fine, but there's kind of these big existential questions. So, kind of thinking as two ends of a spectrum, and how can we address each one, right? So I think that if we're dealing more of these big question, kind of life satisfaction type pain, things like Viktor Frankl, logotherapy, kind of the science of meaning can be a very useful tool, right? He always said there's three pillars to kind of deal with the life satisfaction, more reflective issues, right? So you can find meaning by doing a work or deed, so kind of having a powerful mission, wanting to fully experience someone or something, and third, the attitude we take towards unavoidable suffering. So I think that's kind of a useful framework to deal with that end of the pain spectrum. On the other end, right, like I said, there's the ground level day-to-day. We'll just, how do you feel? How are you? And I think that's where, again, those positive psychology type interventions really come in, where, okay, well, if we exercise, if we meditate, if we do whatever, there's tons of different options. Spend time with people we like. We can just, actually elevate the physiological indicators of happiness. Okay, so again, pain can be both, and we want to go at it, like I said, a war on two fronts. The other part of this is, I think pain is response and stimulus. I got that backwards, shit. Stimulus and response. And so when we think about this, comes kind of informed by Buddhist practice and mindfulness. They really teach, and the Buddha used the analogy of two arrows. Most people, when they feel pain, it's really because they've been shot with two arrows. The first arrow is the actual pain, the stimulus, which is really just nerves firing or, physiological mental chemicals being, reduced, whatever it is. And then there's our reaction to it, our response, and that's the second arrow in a lot of cases. So not only do we feel the stimulus, maybe it's a sensation of pain or, a chemical imbalance that makes us feel down, and we respond to it with, kind of causes more pain, where we very aggressively try to avoid it or try to change things, or freaking out and ruminating, whatever, right? So again, it kind of amplifies the pain. But, with practice, and again, this is easier said than done, right? We can start to just acknowledge perhaps the stimulus that's causing pain, whether it be an event or a physical sensation. Start to try to regulate a little more our response. And again, when I read through this, I think Brickman was extremely gifted, of course, but perhaps this was an area he struggled with a bit as well, self-regulation, based on things like his response to receiving bad feedback or criticism and freaking out. I do believe, and I believe there's research for this, and there's also the contemplative traditions which support this, that with practice, we can begin to condition our responses to the stimulus of pain, right? So learning to perhaps just acknowledge our pain and accept it and choose how we respond to it is a very powerful force. So again, Brickman's story is incredibly tragic, but I do think that it can really contribute to a nuanced discussion of kind of the study of happiness that we're ultimately all engaging with. So thanks for listening. As always, you can comment or message me or whatever you want to talk about this. That's what I love to do.